Men will be required to have children. The most alarming reality facing modern society today is this: governments around the world are moving toward policies that effectively require men to marry and have children, not through direct mandates, but through economic pressures, tax structures, and cultural nudges designed to make singlehood and childlessness unsustainable. Imagine a world where access to basic reproductive choices becomes more expensive, where staying unmarried carries a financial penalty, and where the state actively intervenes to push people into family structures they might not want. This is not some distant dystopia. It is unfolding right now across major economies, from proposals in the United States tied to influential policy frameworks, to direct measures in China and emerging surcharges in Japan. What starts as concern over declining birth rates quickly escalates into coordinated efforts to reverse decades of individual autonomy, and the consequences could reshape everything from personal freedom to economic stability. Stick around until the end, because the data and patterns reveal not just how far this has gone, but why these attempts are likely to backfire spectacularly, accelerating the very disengagement they aim to fix and leaving entire systems teetering on the edge of collapse. Across the globe, fertility rates have plummeted to levels that threaten the long term viability of societies built on continuous population growth and tax funded systems. In the United States, influential organizations like the Heritage Foundation have produced detailed reports and policy recommendations emphasizing the need to prioritize marriage and childbearing as foundational to national flourishing. These materials argue that the decline in traditional family structures has led to widespread social and economic harms, and they propose comprehensive approaches to reverse that trend. One prominent suggestion involves structured government supported programs to prepare individuals for marriage, including intensive training sessions for unmarried people or those expanding their families, culminating in communal ceremonies and ongoing mentorship. Participants could receive financial incentives upon completion, alongside broader tax advantages that make married life significantly more rewarding than remaining single. These ideas tie into a larger vision where marriage receives active promotion through policy tools, such as deeper deductions and credits for couples, while online dating faces discouragement and other modern influences on relationships come under scrutiny. The underlying premise is that society must actively rebuild the family unit to ensure future generations can sustain the nation, with an explicit call for couples to aim for at least two children on average to achieve replacement level fertility. This push extends beyond encouragement into subtle economic restructuring. By enhancing benefits exclusively for married individuals and families, the framework creates a clear financial gradient where single people face relative disadvantages without an outright penalty. This functions as a powerful incentive mechanism, rewarding conformity to traditional roles while making alternative paths less viable over time. Critics have noted that such proposals align with broader ideological views that question the widespread availability of contraception, framing certain methods as contributing to societal ills stemming from shifts in sexual norms over recent decades. While no outright bans appear in these documents, the rhetoric questions the sacrosanct status of certain reproductive tools and calls for fuller examination of their impacts on health and family stability. The result is a policy environment that could gradually restrict access or affordability, not through prohibition, but through reduced protections or altered priorities in healthcare and regulation. Similar dynamics are playing out far beyond American borders, demonstrating that this is a global response to a shared demographic challenge. In China, authorities implemented a significant change to the tax code, effective January 1st, 2026, subjecting condoms, birth control pills, and other contraceptive devices to a 13% value added tax after more than 3 decades of exemption. This adjustment ends a long standing policy that treated these items as essential and tax free, now aligning them with standard rates applied to most goods. The move forms part of a broader strategy combining incentives like subsidies for families with deterrents that raise the cost or inconvenience of avoiding pregnancy. Previous efforts to boost births, including relaxing family planning limits, offering cash rewards, subsidizing housing, extending maternity leave, and supporting fertility treatments, had fallen short of reversing the sharp decline. Birth numbers reached historic lows in recent years, with the population shrinking by millions annually and threatening the workforce needed to power economic growth. Young people cite intense work demands, soaring living costs, and competitive pressures as reasons to delay or avoid parenthood altogether. By making contraception more expensive, the policy seeks to tilt economic calculations toward having children, though it has provoked widespread discussion and concern about unintended effects on public health and personal choices. Japan faces an even more advanced stage of this crisis with fertility rates among the lowest sustained levels anywhere for decades.
The system is collapsing. Cash will be worthless soon. Crypto is your only escape. Angry's Crypto Academy is linked in the description. Go check it out now.
To fund expanded support for child rearing, including allowances, childcare services, and education aid, the government introduced a new surcharge added to medical insurance premiums starting in April 2026. This contribution, amounting to several hundred to around 1,000 yen monthly for many, aims to generate substantial revenue annually to stabilize the population and offset declining taxable income from fewer workers. While applied broadly to all insured residents, the structure has drawn criticism for disproportionately affecting those without children, since benefits flow primarily to families. Higher earners contribute more, and the policy builds on existing tax arrangements that already favor married couples through deductions and other advantages. Public reaction has highlighted the perception that this functions as an indirect burden on unmarried individuals, particularly in a society where economic stagnation since the 1990s has made starting families feel like a luxury rather than a norm. Lifetime single rates have risen dramatically from minimal figures in earlier generations, reflecting deeper shifts in expectations and opportunities. The government views these measures as necessary to prevent further erosion of the social safety net. Yet skeptics argue they overlook root causes like insufficient wages and work life imbalances that deter family formation in the first place. These examples from different cultural and political contexts reveal a common thread. When populations fail to reproduce at replacement levels, states intervene with increasing urgency to encourage or compel higher birth rates. The motivations are straightforward and rooted in mathematics. Fewer children mean fewer future workers, consumers, and taxpayers to support aging populations, fund pensions, drive innovation, and maintain economic momentum. Without new generations entering the system, wealth circulation stagnates, public services strain, and growth prospects dim. Governments recognize that voluntary incentives alone often prove insufficient when individuals prioritize personal freedom, career demands, or financial security over parenthood. As a result, policies evolve towards stronger nudges, including those that alter the cost benefit analysis of remaining childless or unmarried. In this environment, men occupy a particularly pivotal position. After years of societal messages emphasizing independence, self reliance, and skepticism toward traditional commitments, many have chosen paths of solitude and minimal entanglement. This shift stems from observable patterns where expectations placed on men in relationships and family life have grown heavier while rewards have diminished. Economic pressures, legal frameworks perceived as unbalanced, and cultural narratives have contributed to a growing preference for simplicity and peace over the complexities of partnership and provision. Men have increasingly opted out of high risk or high cost roles, focusing instead on personal stability, alternative income streams, or reduced participation in traditional economic structures. This disengagement manifests in lower workforce involvement for some. And by the way, I'm now dropping classic angry guy rant videos exclusively for channel members, and you also get every upload early before it's released to the public. Hit the join button and become a member today. Now let's continue. With individuals pursuing entrepreneurship, investments, or reliance on available support systems rather than conventional employment. The aggregate effect drains taxable revenue, since a significant portion of overall taxes historically comes from male earners, while consumer spending patterns shift away from patterns that once fueled broad economic activity. Women and state institutions now confront the fallout from this withdrawal. Economies built on dual pressures of production and consumption falter when one side reduces output and the other adjusts spending downward. Governments face mounting deficits as revenue sources shrink and entitlement demands from aging demographics rise. The same dynamics that once promoted autonomy now generate calls for men to re engage, to resume roles as providers, partners, and parents. Public figures and analysts describe a crisis requiring urgent correction. Yet these appeals often overlook how the conditions leading to withdrawal developed over time through accumulated experiences and incentives. The core tension lies in the asymmetry of control. While access to intimacy involves mutual decisions, the commitment to reproduction and family sustainability ultimately rests with individual choice, particularly when men prioritize their own well being and autonomy. Attempts to override that choice through policy pressure risk deepening resentment rather than reversing trends. Forced or heavily incentivized arrangements rarely produce genuine bonds or stable units. Instead, they can lead to minimal compliance, emotional distance, or further retreat from societal participation. History shows that civilizations reaching points of coercive measures on personal life choices often accelerate their own decline rather than halt it. This pattern repeats across contexts. When states treat people as demographic units to be managed rather than individuals with agency, resistance builds quietly but powerfully. Men who have discovered contentment and independence show little inclination to return to systems that previously imposed disproportionate burdens. The peace found in solitude proves more valuable than the promises of restored roles. As economic realities worsen for those left navigating higher costs without traditional support networks, the contrast sharpens. Yet, the response from authorities tends toward escalation rather than reflection, doubling down on mechanisms that alienated in the first place. The momentum behind these pro-natalist policies reveals a deeper anxiety among policymakers and institutions that have long relied on predictable demographic patterns to maintain power and economic function. When birth rates fall below replacement for extended periods, the entire architecture of modern welfare states begins to creak under the strain. Pensions promised to current retirees depend on tomorrow's workers paying into the system. Healthcare systems scaled for growing populations face shortages when the ratio of young contributors to elderly dependents inverts. Infrastructure investments assume steady demand growth from new households forming and consuming. Without that engine turning, governments confront a cascade of fiscal shortfalls that no amount of borrowing can indefinitely paper over. The urgency driving these measures stems from cold arithmetic rather than ideology alone. Nations that once viewed population control as a path to prosperity now see unrestricted, individual choice in family size as an existential threat to solvency. In South Korea, the fertility rate has dipped below zero point 0.7 children per woman in recent years, among the steepest declines recorded anywhere. Authorities have responded with an array of escalating interventions. Cash bonuses for each child born now reach tens of thousands of dollars in some regions. Housing subsidies prioritize families over singles. Extended parental leave combines with workplace mandates to encourage men to take paternity time. Tax credits scale upward with additional children. Yet, despite billions spent annually on these programs, the birth rate continues sliding. Young adults cite crushing debt from education, impossible housing prices in urban centers, and work cultures that demand near total devotion to employers as primary barriers. Many express outright rejection of parenthood under current conditions, viewing it as incompatible with personal survival and mental health. The government's latest proposals include direct payments tied to marriage registration and expanded matchmaking services funded by public money. These steps acknowledge that financial carrots alone fail when foundational economic realities remain unchanged. Europe presents a patchwork of similar efforts with varying intensity. Hungary offers lifetime income tax exemptions for women who bear 4 or more children. Poland provides substantial monthly child allowances that decrease sharply for families with fewer offspring. Italy experiments with regional bonuses and priority access to public housing for larger families. France maintains generous family benefits, but has seen gradual erosion of their effectiveness as costs rise faster than support levels. Across the continent, immigration once served as a partial offset to native fertility decline. Yet political shifts have tightened borders in many places, closing that valve and intensifying pressure on domestic reproduction. Leaders speak openly of demographic winter and the need to revive family oriented values. Academic studies funded by governments explore cultural campaigns to reframe parenthood as a patriotic duty rather than a private lifestyle choice. The language increasingly blends national security with personal decisions about family size. Returning to the American context, the intellectual groundwork laid by influential think tanks extends far beyond isolated policy papers. Commentators associated with these frameworks argue that the post 1960s liberalization of sexual norms produced unintended consequences that now require correction through deliberate state action. They point to rising rates of single parent households, delayed marriage, and voluntary childlessness as evidence that unrestricted individual autonomy in intimate matters undermines social cohesion and economic productivity. Proposals include curriculum changes in public education to emphasize the benefits of early marriage and larger families. Regulatory adjustments to healthcare coverage could prioritize fertility preservation over certain preventive measures. Media and cultural influence receive scrutiny, with calls to counter narratives that portray traditional family life as outdated or oppressive. The overarching goal remains restoration of a demographic equilibrium that supports long term national strength, defined not merely by military or economic metrics, but by sustained population vitality. Critics of these approaches highlight the risk of overreach into private spheres historically protected as fundamental rights. They note that similar efforts in authoritarian contexts often produce superficial compliance rather than genuine commitment. People adapt by finding workarounds, delaying decisions further, or emigrating to jurisdictions with fewer restrictions. In democratic systems, backlash can manifest through electoral shifts or cultural resistance that further entrenches the trends policymakers seek to reverse. The attempt to engineer family formation through economic levers assumes rational actors responding predictably to incentives. Yet, human behavior in matters of love, commitment, and reproduction defies simple modeling. Emotional factors, trust levels, perceived fairness in gender roles, and personal experiences of previous generations all shape decisions in ways that financial nudges alone cannot override. Men's role in this equation grows increasingly central as withdrawal patterns solidify. Data from labor force participation studies show sustained declines among prime age males in many advanced economies. Some portion reflects genuine disability or discouragement from job markets that offer limited advancement. Another segment represents deliberate choice toward alternative economic models. Digital platforms enable income generation through content creation, e commerce, freelance services, or cryptocurrency trading without traditional employment structures. Real estate investment, particularly in rental properties or short term accommodations, provides passive streams that require minimal ongoing labor. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. These paths allow men to maintain financial independence while reducing exposure to systems that extract high taxes and demand long hours for diminishing returns. The result compounds the revenue problem for governments already struggling with fewer contributors. Consumer spending patterns shift in tandem. When men reduce discretionary outlays on dating, gifts, shared living expenses, or family oriented purchases, entire sectors feel the impact. Restaurants, entertainment venues, luxury goods, and even basic retail register slower growth in demographics where male participation declines. Women, who historically drive a majority of consumer decisions, find their purchasing power constrained when traditional sources of supplemental income dry up. The so called simp economy, built on male generosity toward female led lifestyles, contracts as more men redirect resources inward. Savings rates among single men rise while debt levels among certain female cohorts increase, reflecting adaptation to new realities. This feedback loop intensifies economic pressure on individuals and states alike. Public discourse begins reflecting these tensions more openly. Influential voices across political spectrums express concern about male disengagement, framing it sometimes as a crisis of purpose, other times as a rational response to unbalanced incentives. Calls emerge for cultural recalibration, urging women to reassess expectations around provision and emotional labor. Some advocate renewed emphasis on mutual respect and partnership rather than unilateral demands. Yet these conversations often occur against a backdrop of lingering resentment from past dynamics, making reconciliation difficult. Men who have built stable, low stress lives show reluctance to re enter arenas perceived as high risk with uncertain rewards. The peace derived from solitude becomes a powerful competing incentive against state sponsored family revival efforts. China's experience illustrates the limits of top down demographic engineering, even in systems with greater control over individual behavior. After decades of strict one child policies that reshaped family norms, authorities reversed course dramatically. Three-child limits replaced earlier restrictions, accompanied by propaganda campaigns promoting larger families as patriotic. Subsidies flowed toward housing, education, and childcare. Yet young urban professionals, shaped by intense competition and material expectations, continue delaying or foregoing parenthood. The condom tax represents a shift toward making non procreative sex more costly. signaling that recreational intimacy without reproductive intent faces official disapproval. Public reaction includes memes, online venting, and quiet circumvention through cross border purchases or alternative methods. The policy may reduce casual contraceptive use in the short term, but risks driving underground activity or further alienation among younger cohorts already skeptical of government intrusion into private life. Japan's insurance surcharge follows a parallel logic. By spreading the cost of child rearing across the entire insured population, the measure effectively taxes childlessness indirectly. Single individuals and couples without children contribute to benefits they do not receive, creating a built in financial incentive to form families eligible for support. The policy arrives amid decades of economic stagnation, youth unemployment or underemployment, and cultural shifts toward individualism. Many young Japanese prioritize personal fulfillment, travel, hobbies, and career flexibility over traditional milestones. Government matchmaking events and fertility clinics receive funding, yet participation remains low. The demographic dividend enjoyed during rapid post war growth has reversed into a burden, with elderly care consuming increasing resources while the working age population shrinks. These international cases demonstrate that no single cultural or political model holds a monopoly on the problem or its attempted solutions. Authoritarian states deploy direct commands and financial penalties. Liberal democracies favor incentives and cultural persuasion. Mixed systems blend elements of both. All confront the same fundamental challenge: convincing individuals to undertake the costs and risks of parenthood when personal calculations favor restraint. The asymmetry persists. Women retain primary control over conception and gestation. Men retain ultimate discretion over long term commitment and resource allocation. When either side opts out en masse, the system strains. Policymakers increasingly recognize that voluntary measures reach diminishing returns. The progression toward stronger economic signals reflects acknowledgement that softer approaches fail to move the needle sufficiently. Yet each escalation carries collateral effects. Higher taxes on singles or childless individuals breed resentment. Reduced contraceptive affordability raises health risks and unintended pregnancies in unstable circumstances. Structured marriage programs risk creating performative unions lacking genuine foundation. The attempt to manufacture families through state machinery often produces brittle structures prone to fracture under pressure. Men observing these developments from the sidelines draw clear lessons. The same institutions now pleading for re engagement once presided over systems that imposed heavy burdens with limited reciprocity. Legal frameworks perceived as favoring one gender in divorce, custody, and support obligations left lasting caution. Cultural messaging that alternated between demanding provision and dismissing male value reinforced skepticism. Economic models that rewarded long hours while eroding real wages diminished the appeal of traditional breadwinner roles. Having adapted to these conditions by minimizing exposure, many men see little reason to reverse course simply because authorities declare an emergency. The path forward remains uncertain. Attempts to compel reproduction through policy pressure could deepen disaffection, driving further withdrawal into informal economies or geographic relocation. Digital nomadism, remote work, and decentralized finance offer escape routes unavailable to previous generations. States may respond with expanded surveillance, tighter financial controls, or intensified cultural campaigns. Each step risks accelerating the very alienation it seeks to cure. The realization settles in slowly but inexorably for those watching these developments unfold. The harder institutions push to recapture male participation in traditional family and economic structures, the more decisively men pull away towards self contained lives that require minimal external validation or obligation. This dynamic creates a feedback spiral where each new policy layer designed to encourage reproduction or marriage instead reinforces the very conditions that make opting out feel like the only sane choice. What begins as concern over birth rates transforms into a contest of wills between state imperatives and individual autonomy, with men holding the stronger hand because their withdrawal costs them less than enforced re engagement would cost everyone else. Consider the psychological architecture that supports this withdrawal. Decades of messaging have taught men that vulnerability in relationships often carries disproportionate risk. Family court outcomes in many jurisdictions still skew toward primary custody for mothers, with child support obligations calculated on income rather than actual involvement, creating lifelong financial anchors even after relationships dissolve. Alimony structures in some places remain tied to lifestyle maintenance rather than need, turning divorce into an economic event that can erase years of accumulated wealth. These realities linger in collective memory, even when reforms soften certain edges. Men entering adulthood today inherit not just statistics, but lived stories from fathers, uncles, friends, and online communities documenting the aftermath of commitments gone wrong. The lesson internalized is straightforward. High downside exposure paired with limited upside control makes long term partnership a gamble few rational actors will take repeatedly. Layer onto that the cultural shift toward portraying traditional male roles as outdated or toxic. Provider expectations persist in practice, while public discourse increasingly frames them as patriarchal relics. Men hear simultaneously that they must step up financially and emotionally, while any assertion of boundaries or traditional preferences draws swift condemnation. The contradiction breeds exhaustion. Why you invest in a system that demands everything while reserving the right to redefine the rules mid game? Solitude offers a clean escape from that double bind. No negotiations over household labor division, no debates about emotional availability quotas, no risk of sudden reclassification from partner to oppressor. Peace arrives not from bitterness, but from simplicity. A man who controls his schedule, his finances, and his environment experiences a form of freedom that no policy incentive has yet matched. Economic adaptations accelerate this separation. The gig economy, remote freelancing, and creator platforms allow income without corporate oversight or 9 to 5 regimentation. A skilled individual can earn enough through consulting, software development contracts, stock trading algorithms, or content monetization to cover modest needs while working fewer hours than traditional employment demanded. Real estate crowdfunding and peer to peer lending provide passive returns that compound without daily labor. Cryptocurrency staking and decentralized finance protocols offer yield opportunities independent of centralized banking systems. These tools did not exist at scale 20 years ago. Their emergence coincides precisely with peak disillusionment among men in their 20s and 30s, giving concrete pathways to financial self sufficiency that bypass the tax heavy, obligation heavy structures governments rely upon. When large numbers of men move into these lower visibility income streams, the fiscal impact compounds quickly. Traditional payroll taxes capture less revenue from independent contractors who structure earnings efficiently. Sales taxes shrink when discretionary spending declines. Property taxes may hold steady in volume, but fail to grow with population driven demand. Corporate income taxes suffer indirectly as consumer facing businesses contract in response to reduced household formation and male driven purchases. Governments facing these shortfalls naturally look for new levers. Consumption taxes rise. Wealth taxes gain traction in some jurisdictions. Surcharges on insurance or utilities spread the burden more broadly. Each new revenue measure hits remaining participants harder, accelerating the incentive to minimize taxable footprint further. The cycle feeds itself. Women navigating this landscape encounter a different set of pressures. Many who once counted on male provision as a default safety net now face housing markets priced for dual incomes, childcare costs that rival full time salaries, and lifestyle expectations shaped during eras of easier abundance. Dating app data consistently shows women maintaining high standards for partner income and status, even as the pool of willing, high earning men shrinks. The mismatch produces frustration visible across social platforms where women express bafflement at male disinterest or accuse entire generations of immaturity. Yet, the economic math remains unforgiving. Single women in urban centers increasingly rely on roommates well into their 30s, delay major purchases, or accept lower living standards than previous cohorts enjoyed. The state steps in with expanded welfare provisions, but these programs rarely match the stability once provided by committed partnerships. Public figures attempt to bridge the gap with appeals that range from pragmatic to moralistic. Business professors warn of looming labor shortages and innovation stagnation without younger cohorts entering the workforce. Media personalities lament a masculinity crisis that leaves men directionless and societies unbalanced. Politicians float ideas for national service programs that blend military training with family formation incentives. Religious leaders emphasize scriptural imperatives for marriage and procreation. Therapists and relationship coaches market courses promising to teach modern men how to navigate commitment without losing autonomy. Each voice adds to the chorus urging return, yet few address the foundational grievances that produced the exit in the first place. The disconnect grows starkest when policymakers propose measures that treat men as resources to be redirected rather than agents with legitimate reasons for their choices. Marriage boot camps, fertility subsidies tied to paternal involvement, tax structures that penalize singlehood more explicitly all presume that men can be nudged or coerced back into roles they have already rejected as net negative. The historical record of such efforts offers little encouragement. Romania, under Ceausescu, criminalized abortion and contraception while mandating gynecological exams for working age women. Birth rates spiked briefly before plummeting as people found ways to resist or flee. East Germany offered generous family benefits, yet still faced chronic low fertility amid broader repression. Singapore's graduate mother scheme and tax breaks for larger families produced marginal gains at best. Authoritarian capacity to enforce demographic targets remains limited even when dissent carries severe consequences. Democratic systems face tighter constraints. Electoral backlash follows perceived overreach into personal liberty. Judicial review strikes down measures that infringe recognized rights. Cultural resistance manifests through humor, memes, and quiet noncompliance. Young men already show higher rates of opting out of dating altogether, with surveys indicating significant percentages content with single status indefinitely. When state pressure intensifies, the likely response is not mass compliance, but deeper entrenchment in alternative lifestyles. Digital communities provide reinforcement, sharing strategies for asset protection, income diversification, and emotional resilience outside traditional frameworks. The internet acts as both escape hatch and echo chamber, normalizing what once seemed marginal. Long-term demographic projections paint a sobering picture regardless of policy success. Countries that maintain replacement fertility through immigration face integration challenges, cultural friction, and political volatility. Those relying purely on native birth recovery confront shrinking workforces within 2 decades and inverted age pyramids within 50 years. Japan offers the clearest preview. Rural areas depopulate, schools consolidate or close, local economies hollow out, elder care consumes ever larger budget shares. Urban centers maintain superficial vitality through technology and efficiency, yet underlying contraction continues. South Korea follows a similar trajectory with even sharper velocity. Europe balances precariously between natalist revival and managed decline. The United States retains some demographic momentum from higher immigration and pockets of higher native fertility, but urban professional classes mirror East Asian patterns of delay and avoidance. Against this backdrop, attempts to force reproduction through economic coercion carry particular irony. Policies that raise the price of childlessness or singlehood aim to make family life the path of least resistance. Yet, they simultaneously make remaining independent more attractive to precisely the demographic whose participation matters most. A man already skeptical of institutional promises sees new taxes or surcharges not as incentives to marry, but as confirmation that the system views him primarily as a revenue source. The rational response becomes further minimization of exposure, geographic relocation to lower tax jurisdictions, intentional underemployment, asset structuring to reduce reportable wealth, reliance on informal networks rather than formal employment. Each adaptation erodes the tax base a little more. The human cost of escalation rarely receives sufficient attention in policy debates. Forced or heavily incentivized unions produce relationships lacking mutual desire. Children raised in environments of resentment or cold obligation inherit instability that echoes through generations. Women partnered with men who feel trapped face emotional isolation, heightened domestic tension, and elevated risk of relational breakdown. Societies built on coerced cohesion sacrifice the voluntary trust that sustains long term stability. History demonstrates that regimes relying on compulsion rather than consent eventually confront legitimacy crises. When personal decisions about family become battlegrounds for state survival, the social contract frays at its most intimate level. Men who have already stepped away watch these developments with a mixture of detachment and vindication. The peace they found proves durable precisely because it rests on self reliance rather than external approval. Daily life consists of manageable routines, meaningful pursuits chosen freely, and financial arrangements that serve personal goals rather than institutional needs. There is no longing for a return to roles that once felt extractive. There is no nostalgia for systems that alternated between demanding provision and dismissing value. The solitude once feared now registers as liberation. Policymakers may eventually pivot toward genuine structural reforms, wage growth that outpaces living costs, housing policies that make family sized units attainable, work cultures that respect boundaries, legal frameworks perceived as equitable across genders. Such changes would address root causes rather than symptoms. Yet, momentum currently favors escalation over introspection. Each failed incentive layer prompts calls for stronger measures rather than reconsideration of premises. The pattern suggests continued intensification until either demographic math forces adaptation or widespread disengagement renders coercion impractical. In the interim, the asymmetry persists. States need bodies and taxpayers to function. Economies need consumers and innovators to grow. Families need willing participants to form and endure. Men who have learned to thrive without fulfilling those roles hold leverage that no legislation can fully negate. Attempts to override that leverage risk accelerating the very collapse they aim to prevent. The harder the push, the farther the retreat. The cycle continues until one side recognizes the futility or both sides reach exhaustion. For now, the direction remains clear. More pressure produces more distance, and the distance grows harder to close with every passing year. The deeper this demographic confrontation progresses, the more evident it becomes that traditional levers of social engineering no longer operate as they once did. Governments and institutions built their legitimacy and fiscal health on the assumption that people would continue forming families at roughly predictable rates, driven by a combination of biological imperatives, cultural norms, and economic necessity. That compact has fractured. What remains is a widening gulf between what states require to remain solvent and what growing numbers of individuals, particularly men, are willing to supply. The resulting scramble produces policies that grow more inventive, more intrusive, and ultimately more self defeating with each iteration. One underappreciated dimension of this shift involves the changing geography of a disengagement. Men who opt for minimal societal participation increasingly concentrate in patterns that amplify their economic footprint's reduction. Some relocate to lower cost regions within their own countries, where housing consumes far less of their income and local tax burdens remain lighter. Others pursue digital nomad visas in jurisdictions that offer favorable tax treatment for remote earners or cryptocurrency gains. Places like Portugal, Estonia, Malaysia, and certain Caribbean nations have created residency programs specifically targeting location independent professionals. These moves strip taxable income from high cost, high tax urban centers where most government revenue traditionally originates. The pattern mirrors corporate tax avoidance strategies, but executed at the individual level. When thousands or tens of thousands of prime age men execute this relocation simultaneously, the revenue loss compounds far beyond what aggregate statistics initially suggest. Within remaining urban cores, visible signs of contraction emerge. Entire apartment complexes built for young professionals and starter families sit partially vacant as cohabitation rates stagnate and marriage ages climb further. Retail districts that once thrived on date night spending and family outings register persistent closures. Public transportation systems designed around commuter surges see ridership plateau or decline among working age cohorts. Universities face enrollment shortfalls in fields that once fed high earning male dominated professions, prompting program cuts and faculty reductions. These micro level changes accumulate into macro level stagnation that no fertility subsidy or marriage incentive has yet reversed. Another layer of adaptation appears in the deliberate cultivation of low maintenance lifestyles. Men who have stepped back from conventional ambition often embrace what economists term voluntary simplicity, though the motivation stems less from environmental ideology than from calculated risk management. Smaller living spaces reduce utility bills and maintenance demands. Minimalist wardrobes eliminate fashion driven spending. Home cooked meals replace frequent dining out. Digital entertainment substitutes for concerts, sports events, and travel that once required disposable income shared with partners. The cumulative effect slashes personal expenditure while preserving quality of life. This frugality starves consumer driven growth models that governments and corporations alike depend upon. When aggregate demand contracts from both reduced production and reduced consumption, the economy enters a slow motion deflationary spiral that conventional monetary tools struggle to counteract. Financial technology accelerates these trends by providing tools for near total control over personal capital. Peer to peer payment systems bypass traditional banking fees. Decentralized wallets shield assets from easy seizure or tracking in contentious legal scenarios. Automated investment platforms execute strategies that once required expensive advisors. Robo advisors and index fund accumulation allow wealth building with minimal ongoing effort. These innovations did not cause male withdrawal, but they drastically lower the barriers to sustaining independence once the decision to disengage has been made. A man earning even a moderate income through sporadic freelance work can now achieve financial security that would have required full time corporate employment 20 years earlier. The margin between survival and comfort narrows dramatically, reducing the coercive power of economic penalties aimed at single or childless individuals. This technological empowerment intersects with shifting attitudes toward legacy. Earlier generations often viewed children as the primary vehicle for immortality, social status, and old age security. Contemporary men, particularly those in their 20s and 30s, increasingly see legacy through different lenses. Digital content that reaches millions, open source contributions that shape industries, or financial independence that frees future time all register as meaningful accomplishments without the biological component. The absence of children no longer carries the same existential weight when personal impact can scale through non familial channels. This redefinition weakens one of the oldest pro natalist arguments, the notion that reproduction represents the highest form of human contribution. When men find equivalent or superior fulfillment elsewhere, the emotional pull toward fatherhood diminishes further. Women confronting these realities encounter a narrowing set of viable paths. Those who prioritize career and independence often discover that biological clocks impose deadlines incompatible with extended professional ramps. Fertility preservation technologies exist but remain expensive and uncertain. Many delay serious partnership search until financial stability arrives, only to find the pool of interested, equally accomplished men significantly reduced. The paradox sharpens. Greater female autonomy and earning power coincide with greater difficulty securing committed male partners who view long term provision as worthwhile. Social media amplifies the frustration through endless scrolls of success stories that mask underlying loneliness or compromise. The narrative of having it all gradually gives way to pragmatic recalibrations. Yet, recalibration often arrives too late to alter demographic outcomes. Institutions respond to this impasse with increasingly creative framing. Public health campaigns recast parenthood as essential preventive medicine against future loneliness epidemics. Economic forecasts highlight the intergenerational transfer problem in stark terms. Fewer workers supporting more retirees equals inevitable benefit cuts or tax hikes. Educational materials in secondary schools incorporate modules on family economics and relationship sustainability. Corporate human resource departments offer enhanced fertility benefits and family formation leave policies, hoping to normalize earlier commitment among employees. Religious organizations expand outreach to young adults with community building events centered on shared values around marriage and children. Each initiative seeks to rebuild cultural scaffolding that once supported family formation organically, but now requires deliberate reconstruction. The cumulative weight of these efforts produces diminishing returns, punctuated by occasional counterproductive backlash. When policies single out childlessness or singlehood too explicitly, online discourse erupts in mockery and defiance. Hashtags documenting opt out lifestyles gain viral traction. Forums dedicated to male financial independence share detailed guides on asset protection, geographic arbitrage, and psychological resilience against guilt based appeals. The very attempt to shame or incentivize re engagement often strengthens resolve to remain detached. Social proof shifts. What once appeared deviant now registers as sensible self preservation among peer groups. Longer term societal reconfiguration begins to emerge in places furthest along the demographic curve. Rural Japan offers case studies in managed contraction. Communities consolidate services around shrinking populations. Autonomous delivery robots handle last mile logistics in depopulated areas. Elder co housing arrangements replace traditional multi generational households. Healthcare shifts toward prevention and remote monitoring to stretch limited personnel. These adaptations demonstrate resilience rather than collapse. Yet they also normalize a future with fewer children and fewer families at the center. Similar patterns appear in parts of Italy, Spain, and Eastern Germany, where outmigration of young adults leaves behind aging majorities. The transition proves survivable through technology and efficiency gains, but it fundamentally alters the texture of social life. In contrast, nations that double down on natalist coercion risk internal fracture lines. Attempts to link citizenship benefits, housing access, or career advancement to family status create new forms of resentment. Underground networks emerge to share strategies for appearing compliant while minimizing actual reproduction or marriage. Cross border fertility tourism grows as couples seek jurisdictions with fewer restrictions on reproductive choice. Black markets for contraception flourish when official channels become cost prohibitive or stigmatized. Each workaround erodes state authority a little further while reinforcing cynicism toward institutional motives. The ultimate irony surfaces here. Policies designed to preserve civilization through higher birth rates may hasten its transformation into something less familiar and less cohesive. When reproduction becomes a state managed outcome rather than an organic expression of human connection, the resulting families often lack the durability needed to transmit values across generations. Children raised in environments of obligation rather than enthusiasm inherit ambivalence toward the very institutions that engineered their existence. Trust erodes. Civic participation declines. The social fabric frays precisely because the threads were forced together rather than woven willingly. Men who remain on the periphery of these experiments observe with clinical detachment. Their lives continue along trajectories of controlled risk and deliberate enjoyment. Mornings begin with personal routines rather than commutes. Afternoons allow pursuit of hobbies, skill development, or simple rest without justification. Evenings belong to chosen company or solitude, free from negotiation. Financial arrangements stay lean and resilient. Health receives consistent attention because longevity serves individual goals rather than societal quotas. The absence of drama, financial hemorrhage, or emotional labor registers not as deprivation, but as abundance. Policymakers facing this reality confront a narrowing menu of genuine options. They can persist with escalation, accepting accelerating disengagement as collateral damage. They can attempt root cause reforms that restore economic optimism, perceive fairness, and cultural reciprocity, though such changes require political capital few leaders possess. Or they can prepare for managed demographic transition, redesigning institutions around smaller, older more concentrated populations sustained by technology and selective immigration. Most current trajectories favor the first path because it postpones painful structural adjustments while maintaining the illusion of control. Yet postponement has limits. Each year of continued fertility below replacement locks in deeper contraction 2 decades later. Each cohort of men who solidify independence reduces the pool available for future course correction. Each failed policy experiment further normalizes withdrawal as rational behavior. The window for voluntary realignment closes incrementally. What remains is the slow realization that no amount of financial pressure or moral suasion can compel people to produce children or form families against their considered judgment. Agency, once unleashed, proves difficult to recapture. The story therefore moves toward resolution through attrition rather than triumph. States will continue experimenting until the costs of coercion exceed the costs of adaptation. Societies will shrink, age, and reconfigure until a new equilibria emerge. Individuals, particularly men who mastered self sufficiency early, will persist in patterns that prioritize personal sovereignty over collective imperatives. The demographic engine that powered modernity for centuries winds down not with a dramatic crash, but with quiet, persistent withdrawal. The peace men have claimed becomes both symptom and cause of a world that must learn to function with far fewer willing participants than it once assumed necessary. The path of least resistance for institutions facing irreversible demographic contraction increasingly points toward acceptance rather than reversal. Rather than continuing to expend political capital and fiscal resources on measures that yield diminishing or negative returns, forward looking administrations begin quietly shifting emphasis from population growth to population management. This pivot does not announce itself with fanfare. It appears first in budget documents that allocate proportionally more toward elder care infrastructure, automated service delivery, and labor substituting technologies, while quietly scaling back family formation subsidies that consistently underperform. The rhetoric softens from urgent calls to repopulate to pragmatic discussions of sustainable, smaller societies. The change registers as realism rather than surrender. Yet it marks the moment when the dream of restoring mid 20th century fertility patterns finally yields to the arithmetic of what actually proves achievable. Automation fills many of the gaps left by shrinking workforces faster than most observers anticipated even a decade ago. Robotic process automation handles repetitive administrative tasks in government offices, hospitals, and financial institutions. Autonomous vehicles and drone delivery networks reduce dependence on human drivers and couriers in urban logistics. Artificial intelligence systems manage inventory, customer service inquiries, and even preliminary medical diagnostics with accuracy that rivals or exceeds human performance in narrow domains. These technologies do not require the constant influx of young workers once deemed essential to sustain economic output. Instead, they allow existing populations to maintain productivity levels with fewer bodies. Nations that embrace this transition earliest gain competitive advantages in per capita output, even as absolute population declines. The economic model shifts from labor intensive growth to capital and technology intensive stability. Gross domestic product per person becomes the more relevant metric than total GDP. And countries that adapt quickly see their living standards hold steady or improve despite demographic headwinds. Immigration policy evolves in tandem, though not always smoothly. Where earlier waves aimed at rapid numerical replenishment, newer approaches prioritize selective criteria focused on skills, language proficiency, cultural compatibility, and immediate economic contribution. Points based systems expand in countries that previously relied on family reunification or humanitarian pathways as primary channels. The goal moves from sheer volume to targeted integration of individuals who can support the fiscal burden rather than add to it. This shift reduces political friction in receiving societies while addressing the most pressing revenue and innovation needs. Critics argue the approach commodifies human beings, yet proponents counter that uncontrolled inflows strain social cohesion and public services more severely than calibrated selection ever could. The result is a slower, more deliberate form of demographic adjustment that buys time for native born adaptation without promising a return to rapid population expansion. Urban planning adapts to smaller, older cohorts by redesigning cities for density without sprawl. Vertical communities replace horizontal expansion. Mixed use developments cluster housing, healthcare, retail, and recreation within short walking distances or seamless public transit loops. Age in place features become standard. Wider doorways, zero step entries, smart home monitoring for falls or medical emergencies, communal green spaces that double as social hubs for isolated seniors. Public transportation prioritizes accessibility over speed with low floor vehicles, priority seating, and real time audio visual aids. These modifications make mid sized and large cities more livable for populations where the median age creeps past 50. Rural areas, meanwhile, consolidate into regional service hubs connected by high speed rail or electric autonomous shuttles. Depopulated villages either revert to nature or transform into specialized retreats for remote workers seeking quiet and low taxes. The landscape literally reshapes itself around the new reality of fewer people spread differently. Healthcare delivery undergoes parallel transformation. Telemedicine becomes the default for routine consultations, freeing physical facilities for complex procedures and emergencies. Wearable sensors and implanted monitors provide continuous data streams to centralized AI triage systems that flag anomalies before patients experience symptoms. Preventive interventions shift upstream through personalized nutrition plans, exercise algorithms, and pharmaceutical regimens tailored to genetic profiles. The focus moves from extending life at all costs to maximizing healthy years within realistic resource constraints. Palliative and hospice care expand dramatically as societies confront the inevitability of mortality among larger elderly cohorts. End of life conversations normalize earlier, reducing the intensity of last minute interventions that once consumed disproportionate budgets. The entire medical ecosystem recalibrates to serve a demographic pyramid inverted from its historical shape. Education systems follow suit by emphasizing lifelong learning over front loaded youth training. Universities pivot toward modular, stackable credentials that adults can acquire incrementally throughout careers. Vocational training integrates with workplace apprenticeships that continue into midlife. Primary and secondary schools consolidate as student numbers fall, redirecting resources toward quality rather than quantity. Curriculum updates stress adaptability, digital literacy, financial independence, and emotional resilience, skills suited to a world where traditional family safety nets weaken and individual self reliance becomes non negotiable. The goal shifts from preparing masses of young workers for predictable industrial roles to equipping smaller cohorts for fluid, technology augmented environments where career changes occur multiple times. Social welfare frameworks undergo the most politically contentious redesign. Pension ages rise incrementally, often tied to gains in healthy life expectancy. Benefit formulas adjust to reflect longer contribution periods and shorter retirement spans relative to total lifespan. Means testing expands so that high net worth retirees receive reduced public transfers. Universal basic services replace some cash entitlements, guaranteeing access to essentials like housing support, health care, and nutrition while allowing discretionary income to vary. These changes spark resistance from cohorts who paid into systems under different expectations, yet actuarial necessity eventually prevails. The alternative, unsustainable debt accumulation or abrupt cuts, proves politically even more toxic. Societies grudgingly accept that intergenerational promises made during high fertility eras cannot bind future generations with fewer contributors. Cultural narratives evolve to match the emerging material conditions. Media representations increasingly portray singlehood and childlessness as valid, even admirable life paths rather than deviations from an ideal norm. Popular entertainment features protagonists who find purpose through creative work, community involvement, travel, or mentorship without biological offspring. Literature explores the richness of chosen families, deep friendships, and self directed legacies. Public intellectuals frame demographic transition as an opportunity to rethink human flourishing beyond reproduction. Environmental arguments gain renewed traction, positing that smaller populations ease pressure on finite resources and allow more sustainable stewardship of the planet. These cultural shifts do not erase lingering grief over lost traditions, but they reduce the stigma attached to non traditional trajectories and help normalize the inevitable. Men who pioneered early withdrawal find their choices retrospectively validated by these broader adaptations. What once appeared as antisocial retreat now registers as prescient adaptation to a contracting system. Their emphasis on personal financial sovereignty, minimal obligations, and psychological self sufficiency aligns closely with the skills and mindset societies increasingly reward in the new equilibrium. Having avoided the heaviest burdens during the transition period, they enter the reconfigured landscape with greater flexibility and fewer anchors. The irony is sharp. The very disengagement once labeled selfish or immature positions them advantageously in a world forced to value individual resilience over collective reproduction. Women who navigated the same period without reliable male partnership develop parallel strengths. Many build robust professional networks, accumulate independent wealth, and cultivate non romantic support circles that provide emotional and practical scaffolding. Those who did form families often do so later and smaller, concentrating resources on fewer children with deliberate intensity. Single mothers leverage expanded state childcare, flexible work arrangements, and community cooperatives to manage responsibilities that once required a full time co parent. The overall picture shows adaptation rather than catastrophe, though the adaptation carries costs in loneliness, financial strain, and missed opportunities that no policy can fully mitigate. The global distribution of these transitions varies by starting conditions. Wealthier nations with strong technological bases and established social safety nets manage the shift with less visible disruption. Developing economies that have not yet completed demographic transition face sharper dilemmas. Continued high fertility in some regions collides with rapid fertility collapse in others, producing uneven pressures on migration, resource allocation, and political stability. International institutions attempt to coordinate responses through knowledge sharing platforms, technology transfer agreements, and conditional financing tied to adaptive reforms, yet sovereignty concerns and differing cultural priorities limit the scope of truly unified action. In the end, the story resolves not through dramatic reversal, but through incremental, often reluctant, accommodation. Birth rates stabilize at sub replacement levels across most advanced economies. Populations peak, plateau, then gradually descend over centuries rather than decades. Economic output decouples further from population size. Living standards depend more on innovation, efficiency, and resource management than on sheer numbers. Societies become older, smaller, quieter, more deliberate. The frantic energy that characterized high growth eras gives way to a steadier rhythm focused on quality over quantity. Men who walked away early do not gloat over this outcome. They simply continue living the lives they chose, structured yet flexible, responsible yet unbound, present yet detached from collective demands. Their solitude, once a private refuge, now mirrors a broader societal condition where fewer people share the burdens and the benefits more evenly among those who remain. The state no longer expects them to rescue collapsing systems through reproduction or provision. The economy no longer requires their maximum taxable output to fuel endless expansion. The culture no longer frames their choices as pathology. What began as resistance to unbalanced incentives concludes as quiet coexistence with a transformed reality. The attempt to force men back into roles they had already rejected accelerated the very changes that made those roles obsolete. Coercion failed because it misunderstood the nature of the withdrawal, not rebellion for its own sake, but rational self preservation in the face of deteriorating risk reward ratios. When the system finally stops demanding what men will no longer supply voluntarily, a strange equilibrium emerges. It is not the flourishing once promised by traditional family structures. It is not the collapse feared by demographers. It is something more ordinary and more durable, a world learning to sustain itself with far fewer participants and the individuals who anticipated that world thriving within its constraints. The intensity that once surrounded debates over marriage, children, and male responsibility fades into historical footnote. Future generations, raised in smaller cohorts with different expectations, will view the early 21st century's fertility panic much as we view earlier moral panics over declining religiosity or changing gender roles, as a transitional anxiety that eventually gave way to pragmatic acceptance. The roads that once converged on traditional provision and reproduction now diverge toward diverse, self directed paths. Men who chose solitude did not destroy society. They simply declined to prop up a model that had stopped serving them. In doing so, they helped force the adaptation that survival required. The equilibrium that emerges from this long withdrawal carries implications few anticipated when the first waves of disengagement began. Societies that once measured vitality through population pyramids now recalibrate success around density of talent, depth of innovation, and resilience of systems built for fewer users. The frantic race to reverse fertility decline gives way to a colder assessment. Some nations will shrink gracefully, others will fracture under the weight of unaddressed imbalances, and a few will reinvent themselves around radically different organizing principles. The men who stepped away earliest become, unintentionally, the advanced scouts of this reordering, living proof that life can remain rich, purposeful, and materially secure without feeding the traditional demographic machine. One of the clearest markers of this shift appears in the changing composition of national wealth. In places where population contraction has progressed furthest, asset values decouple from demographic scale. Real estate in depopulated regions collapses while prime urban land, scarce, walkable, technologically dense, appreciates sharply. Those who own such property, often older cohorts who purchased decades earlier, capture windfall gains that younger generations can no longer access through conventional wage labor. The result is a form of intergenerational transfer that bypasses children entirely. Wealth flows sideways through inheritance to nieces, nephews, friends, charitable foundations, or simply evaporates into higher estate taxes. Men who built modest portfolios through disciplined investing and geographic arbitrage find themselves in unexpectedly strong positions relative to peers who remain tethered to high cost family formation. Their financial independence, once a defensive posture, now looks like strategic foresight. Labor markets reflect the same resorting. Employers facing persistent talent shortages pivot hard toward capital substitution wherever possible. Factories install collaborative robots that work alongside the remaining human staff rather than replacing them outright. Offices adopt hybrid models that reduce square footage and utility costs while allowing workers to live wherever broadband reaches. Compensation packages emphasize flexibility, mental health resources, and equity stakes over base salary increases that would merely fuel higher living costs. The most desirable roles go to individuals who demonstrate self direction, continuous upskilling, and low drama, precisely the traits many withdrawn men have honed during years of operating outside corporate hierarchies. Companies quietly prefer hiring people who treat employment as one revenue stream among several rather than the central pillar of identity. The old psychological contract, loyalty for security, dissolves. In its place emerges a transactional understanding that benefits both sides when trust in long term institutions has eroded. This transactional ethos extends into personal relationships of all kinds. Friendships, once expected to deepen through shared family milestones, now form around common interests, proximity, or mutual utility. Men maintain wide but shallow networks that provide companionship without emotional entanglement or financial exposure. Women who remain single longer adopt similar strategies, building support through professional sisterhoods, hobby groups, co living arrangements, or paid services that once fell to family members. The language of chosen family gains mainstream traction not as a progressive slogan, but as practical necessity. Marriage, when it occurs, tends toward later ages, explicit contracts, and clearer exit paths. Prenuptial agreements become routine rather than exceptional. Couples approach the institution with the same due diligence they apply to major purchases, aware that state incentives or cultural pressure no longer guarantee durability. Fertility itself fragments into increasingly diverse pathways. Assisted reproduction technologies mature and drop in price, allowing single women, same sex couples, and even small groups of friends to pursue parenthood without traditional partnership. State funded egg freezing and IVF cycles expand in some jurisdictions as a pragmatic response to delayed family formation. Surrogacy markets professionalize under stricter regulation, creating legal frameworks that protect all parties while meeting demand from wealthier individuals who want children but not spouses. Adoption processes streamline for older applicants and non traditional households. The result is a smaller total number of births distributed across a broader array of family configurations. Biological parenthood becomes one option among many rather than the default expectation. Children grow up in environments where parents may include multiple adults in fluid, negotiated roles, biological contributors, financial backers, daily caregivers, mentors, none of whom necessarily share a household or romantic history. Education adapts to prepare young people for this multiplicity. Curricula introduce financial literacy earlier, teaching compound interest, tax optimization, asset protection, and the mathematics of different life paths. Relationship education moves beyond abstinence or romance to cover negotiation skills, boundary setting, conflict resolution, and the economic realities of cohabitation versus independence. Students learn to model lifetime cash flows under scenarios that include singlehood, serial monogamy, childlessness, single parenthood, blended families, and communal living. The goal is not to steer toward any particular outcome, but to equip individuals to choose with clear eyes rather than inherited scripts. Critical thinking modules examine demographic propaganda from all angles: pro natalist campaigns, anti family rhetoric, corporate messaging that glorifies hustle culture, so that future adults can separate institutional self interest from personal well being. Mental health infrastructure expands in response to the loneliness that accompanies smaller, more dispersed populations. Public campaigns normalize solitude as a legitimate preference rather than a symptom of dysfunction. Therapy modalities diversify to address the specific stresses of chosen independence. Decision fatigue around long term planning without a default partner, anticipatory grief over absent grandchildren, or guilt triggered by family members who still expect traditional milestones. Peer support networks flourish online and in person, connecting people who share similar life architectures regardless of age or background. Pharmacological and non pharmacological interventions for anxiety and depression become more accessible and less stigmatized. The cultural baseline shifts from viewing partnership as essential to human flourishing toward recognizing it as one valid route among several, each with its own trade offs. Economic theory begins to catch up with these lived realities. Traditional growth models that assume perpetual population increase lose explanatory power. New frameworks emerge that prioritize total factor productivity, resource circularity, and quality adjusted life years over raw output expansion. Degrowth advocates gain credibility not as fringe environmentalists, but as pragmatic analysts describing what is already happening. Mainstream economists publish papers modeling steady state economies where zero population growth coincides with stable or rising living standards through technological deflation and efficiency gains. Central banks experiment with monetary policies designed for low inflation, low growth environments rather than perpetual expansion. Fiscal policy shifts toward maintaining social cohesion in aging societies rather than stimulating consumption among shrinking working age cohorts. International relations reflect the same demographic rebalancing. Nations with younger populations gain leverage through labor exports and remittances. Countries that mastered early fertility transition wield soft power through technological leadership and capital surpluses. Migration corridors realign toward mutual benefit rather than unilateral flows. Wealthier, shrinking societies offer residency and citizenship pathways to skilled individuals from high fertility regions in exchange for economic contribution and cultural alignment. Geopolitical tensions ease in some areas as resource demands moderate with smaller populations, while new flashpoints emerge around control of automated production capacity and artificial intelligence infrastructure. Climate adaptation becomes more feasible when fewer people compete for arable land, water, and coastal real estate. Through all of this transformation, the men who first walked away remain largely peripheral figures, neither celebrated nor vilified, simply present in smaller numbers and quieter ways. Their lives continue to demonstrate that meaning, status, and security can derive from sources other than family provision or corporate assent. They mentor younger men informally through forums and private networks, sharing practical knowledge about financial structuring, psychological boundaries, and selective engagement with institutions. They invest in technologies that further reduce dependence on traditional systems. They travel lightly, maintain health rigorously, and cultivate interests that provide intrinsic reward. Their existence serves as living evidence that opting out does not equate to failure or nihilism. It can represent a deliberate, sustainable alternative when the dominant model deteriorates. Women who travel parallel paths develop their own forms of resilience and innovation. Many become the backbone of emerging community structures, co housing initiatives, mutual aid networks, professional collectives that replace some functions once handled by extended families. They drive demand for flexible work, elder care solutions, and reproductive technologies. They redefine success in terms that emphasize autonomy, impact, and chosen relationships rather than conventional markers. The competition that once characterized dating markets softens as both genders lower expectations around provision and permanence, focusing instead on compatibility in values, lifestyle, and mutual respect. Eventually, the demographic panic that dominated early 21st century discourse fades from public consciousness. Younger generations encounter it primarily as history lessons or cautionary tales about over reliance on population growth. The anger that once fueled online movements gives way to pragmatic acceptance. Men no longer need to walk away en masse because the system no longer demands their participation in the same totalizing way. The pressure valves release. Coercive nudges disappear as they prove counterproductive. Incentives soften into neutral frameworks that neither punish nor reward family choices excessively. What remains is a world that runs on fewer people yet still functions. Slower in some dimensions, more deliberate in others, more technologically augmented across the board. Cities contract gracefully, countryside rewilds in patches. Innovation concentrates in fewer minds, but scales globally through digital means. Social bonds form intentionally rather than by default. Loneliness persists as a human constant, yet so does creativity, humor, curiosity, and the capacity for connection when people choose it freely. The angry energy that once defined the reaction to unbalanced incentives dissipates into a quieter confidence. The proof is in the living. Men who refused to be conscripted into a failing demographic project did not doom society. They simply declined to be the last ones holding up a structure that had already begun to buckle under its own contradictions. Society adapted because it had no choice. It learned to value quality over quantity, resilience over expansion, individual sovereignty over collective obligation. And in that adaptation, the very freedom those early walkers claimed became available to far more people, not as rebellion, but as ordinary possibility. Shout out to the 1 hour gang who stayed locked in for the full ride. If these angry guy breakdowns are hitting the way they should, and you want to keep the fire going, grab me a Red Bull through the link in the description. Hit the comments and tell me straight what part of this long arc landed heaviest for you. Do you buy that the system eventually stops fighting the tide and just learns to swim with it? Do you see the same quiet acceptance starting to take root where you are? Lay it out, no filter. Like the video if it earned it, subscribe if you're not already in, share it if it deserves to spread, and always remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.